Good morning, Grammar. Through the Romantic period, the orchestra got larger and larger, and this continues a pattern which goes back through the classical period and also the Baroque period. So that's what I'd like us to explore today. We'll just go through, first of all, a few of the key instruments that are in an orchestra. So the orchestral instruments are divided by the way that they make their sound. So essentially, if you blow down the instrument, it is called a woodwind instrument. And the four that you find in the orchestra are the flute, the oboe, the clarinet, and the bassoon. Now, the flute, you simply blow straight across the hole. There's nothing in between you and the instrument making its sound. The clarinet has a thin piece of reed, which is sometimes made out of plastic, but otherwise very thin wood, and that vibrates against the mouthpiece when you blow down it. The oboe and the bassoon is the only bass instrument in the woodwind section, as Beethoven knew it anyway. They have two pieces of wood which vibrate against each other when you blow down it. But either way, you just blow down it as you would blow across a bottle or blow down two blades of grass, if you ever tried that in the Jesuit gardens during the summer. And that's how those instruments make their sound. And they usually have keys on the tube that you're blowing down to control the pitch of the sound. Brass instruments are slightly different in that they're still made out of a tube. You still blow down it, and nowadays many of them have various keys or valves or buttons on them. But the way you blow down it is to blow a raspberry down it. That sort of sound. Depending on the length of the tube, that produces a set of sounds. So essentially, if you do a slightly tighter raspberry, it makes a higher note, and if you do a much looser one, it makes a lower note. And the three instruments that we have in the orchestra are the trumpet, which often has three valves, the trombone, and the tuba. There's also the French horn. Sometimes, although it's a brass instrument, it's used in the same passages as the woodwind section because it's a slightly softer sound, partly because on a trumpet, a trombone, and a trumpet on a trombone in particular, the sound, the bell of the trumpet and trombone points forwards, but on a tuba it points upwards, still out towards the audience, but on a French horn it points behind you. Percussion can be almost anything, but it's divided into two categories. First of all, you have pitched percussion. That is percussion where you can tell what note it is that is being played. So examples are timpani, xylophone, glockenspiel. There are others. And then there are the unpitched percussion. So where you can't tell what pitch they are. Now they can still be higher or lower. So for example, a really low one would be bass drum, but you can't set it to say a C. A timpani can play a C. A bass drum just plays a thud. Similarly, a snare drum is actually quite a high pitch, but it's not got a note name. You can't get a snare drum to play a C, but it is a higher note, if you like, than the bass drum. It's more of a crack sound. Cymbals, again, are quite high. And again, there are many others. Percussion instruments, certainly by the beginning of the 20th century, are pretty much anything percussionists can get their hands on to hit or scrape or whatever they want to do to them. The string section is pretty standard, and it's the same section really right through from the beginning of the Baroque period right through to the present day, even in modern film scores. And it really forms the heart of the orchestra. This is what the difference is between an orchestra and a wind band, is that the strings take most of the music, and string players tend to be playing throughout a piece. So there are two sections of violins, which are obviously called violin 1 and violin 2. Then there's violas, and then there's cellos and basses, double basses. The orchestra has developed gradually over the period since the Baroque period to the present day. We're going to look today just at how it's developed from Bach to Beethoven. So Bach had his string section, and he also might use trumpets and timpani. Not always, but sometimes. And he also might use woodwind. But he wouldn't always have woodwind available, and if he did, there'd only be a few. So you might have something like 4 to 6 first violins, 4 to 6 second violins, about 3 or 4 violas, 3 or 4 cellos, and maybe 1 or 2 double basses, plus the somewhere between 3 and 6 woodwind players, plus the 4 brass players. That's quite a small orchestra. That's smaller than the Stonyhurst Orchestra in terms of the string section, but also the woodwind section, certainly. And he wouldn't always use all of those. He'd always have the strings, but he wouldn't always have both woodwind and brass. One of his most famous pieces, the orchestral suite in number 3 in D major, he uses the strings and he uses the brass, and the only reason he uses the brass is because his son added the parts several years later. So often he'd have a smaller orchestra, and even the maximum size was somewhere around 25. If you move on to Mozart, Mozart adds clarinets into the orchestra. He uses the woodwind more often, and he uses the brass more often. And he has this full violin section, this full string section rather. And you'll note that I'm calling the last line of the string section celli and double basses. They don't have separate lines. The cello part and the double bass part are basically the same part, except sometimes the double basses drop out and leave the cellos to it. But right through Mozart's time, in the classical era, the cellos and the double basses are pretty much playing the same thing most of the time. And then we move on to Beethoven. So Beethoven might have more flutes and oboes and clarinets and bassoons. He also introduces the trombones into the orchestra and occasionally some other percussion. And then at the very bottom, you'll see I've separated cellos and double basses because they can now be more independent of each other. The other interesting thing that Beethoven does in 2 pieces at almost opposite ends of his career, at the very beginning of his career, he wrote a piece for, it's mostly strings with a little bit of woodwind, and piano, and choir, called the Choral Fantasia. And by the time you get to the end of his career, his 9th symphony, he only wrote 9, his 9th symphony is known as the Choral Symphony, and that's got the really famous Ode to Joy music in, which those of you who are in orchestra will have played last term. And there he has a full orchestra, plus he adds a choir to make it even louder. And as well as that, Beethoven is starting to write not just F for forte and FF for fortissimo, but 3 or even 4 Fs, and indeed 3 or even 4 Ps, to expand the dynamic range of the orchestra. And the string instruments in his orchestra, he's got more of them. So he might have 8, 10, even 12 in each section, double the size of Bach's string sections, because he's got more of the woodwind and brass, and because the woodwind and brass are actually much better instruments and you can play them more loudly. So your task for today is twofold. First of all, the diagram that you've just seen on the screen, I'd like you to make your own version of that, where it's clear which of the instruments have been added by which composer. I'd also like you to find a piece by each composer that matches the largest possible disposition of the orchestra that they had available to them at that time. So you're looking for a Bach piece that uses as many of those instruments as possible, a Mozart piece that uses as many instruments of those as possible, and also a Beethoven piece that uses the fullest orchestra possible. I think I've already given you a clue on what that might be. And if you could please add a YouTube or Spotify link to your diagram of the development of the orchestra, so that I can check the piece that you found it from. And if you could upload that to Firefly on the task that I've set you there, please, and I will check that you've got it right and that is accurate. And as ever, I'll be logged into the clinic throughout the lesson, so you can ask me any questions that you have there. I hope you enjoy your voyage of discovery. On YouTube, you'll see there's lots of copies of pieces that have score in. So if you type Beethoven Symphony score, you will come up with performances that have the score scrolling at the same time, which makes it easy to find out what the instruments are. Or you could challenge yourself a little bit more by watching a video of somebody performing it and identifying all the instruments that are there. It'll be good to see you in a few moments over in the clinic. I hope you enjoy today's work.